Sure, I'll be more than happy to, but if you allow me, I'll stand. I find it easier to speak in that way, even if there is no podium or formal PowerPoint. First of all, let me say that unlike most of the speakers, I no longer represent any government or official institution. So I can say pretty much what I think. And I hope to make this more entertaining, but maybe also more frank through that measure. First of all, I'll talk briefly about the Euroization issue in general from our experience. Then I'll talk about the timing issue, because I think that's an issue which is now very relevant. When should you enter and what's the impact? And then I'll briefly remark to some of the things said by my colleagues. In terms of Euroization, I think a crisis has been very useful in terms of curing Central and Eastern Europe of this newly fashionable Euroscepticism that was beginning to pervade the region. I mean, since the accession and, as the economies were growing and we were all getting richer and moving around Europe, I began to sense over, until about 2008 and 9, this kind of fashionable skepticism of the Brussels bureaucracy and the European mammoth, and it was becoming really fashionable to be Eurosceptic in our region. And I think the crisis was very good in showing us that for our countries, Europe is the thing. I mean, we need the single market. We need Europe. And actually, if this was ever to break up or become much weaker, we would be the primary victims of that. And I think that was really, really good. And the reason why I think so is that once such a climate is deeply established, it actually becomes quite difficult to change. My former PhD supervisor, who is now a quite close friend of mine in the UK, he told me that he's been doing monetary economics for 30 years now in the UK. He said when he was a young assistant professor in the UK, the monetary economists in the UK were kind of more pro-Europe and more for monetary integration. And then he said, through a combination of influences ranging from the US and other things, there have been fewer and fewer of them. And actually, he says he's now one of the last of the dying breeds of the kind of pro-Euro monetary economists in the UK. And once that's established so firmly, it's very difficult to change. He told me recently when we talked that even the crisis hasn't changed anything about that. In terms of the academic debate, in terms of the influential people in the academic circles, I mean, that's not the industrialists, that's not the other people, but in terms of the academic debate. So I think it's very good that this didn't happen here in the region. The second thing I would like to say is that in terms of the economics of the Euroization, the one thing that I haven't heard much today is that we are not facing the situation of the creation of the monetary union. We are facing a situation of joining an existing and big monetary union. And why is that important? Is that when you look at the benefits, and we had a very brief but very good presentation on the benefits of monetary union, they are done from a collective point of view. So, is it the wise thing to create the monetary union? But actually, the monetary union exists. So the question now is it the wise thing to join the monetary union? And there, I think there's one very strong argument for Euro adoption politically and partially economically, which doesn't sound much in the policy debate, and that's what I would call a competitive Euroization. And by competitive Euroization, I mean, or Euro adoption, the fact that if you are Central European 4 countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, and if a Volkswagen is deciding where do we build our next car, if a single country has Euro, it's a very strong influence. And actually, you could see that the reason why I'm using Volkswagen is that Volkswagen was recently deciding where to set up a new car production in one of its existing plants. And you could argue that given the depreciation of all the currencies but the euro, certainly Czech Republic would be the primary location. But they chose Bratislava, Slovakia. And the reason they said is, look, yes, the Czechs are now way cheaper, 25% over last year, but we don't know where they're going to be next year. And certainly we don't know where they're going to be 5 years from now. So, for us to be able to plan is the vital thing. And of course, that's a kind of very anecdotal thing, but I think that's the thing that tends to influence policymakers much more, is not whether we would like to create Eurozone if it didn't exist, but whether we would like to actually join it. The same argument applies vice versa, that if you are a single Eurozone member state among non-Eurozone member states, there are some also negative influences. And I'll give one example from Slovakia, which is which concerns labor market movements. Slovakia is one of the most open labor market countries in Europe. We have actually, the estimates are that approximately 9 to 10% of our labor force actually work abroad. And by a series of accidents, nearly all of them work in non-Eurozone countries: Czech Republic, Hungary, Britain, and Ireland. Sorry, Ireland is in Eurozone, but actually Ireland is the smallest one. So these three. So what we saw actually over the last year as these economies crashed, but also as their currencies depreciated, decreasing the euro earnings of these people, we've seen massive re-influx of Slovaks back home. Unlike in Poland, where from what I've been reading, the massive return of Poles has not happened to such an extent. And so actually it's estimated that around 2 to 3% of overall employment or overall labor force returned to Slovakia just in a space of 1 year. And that meant that the unemployment increased by additional 2 to 3 points above what it would just based on the domestic situation. So, and of course, if Czech Republic and Hungary were in the Eurozone, this would not happen. But because they are not, our people came back, or they stopped commuting, I should say, because actually it's not so much emigration as a daily or weekly commuting thing. The next thing I would like to say is on the timing. And on the timing, actually, I would say it's not such a bad thing to enter in a crisis as we did. And the reason why it's not so bad to enter in a crisis is that if you enter in good times, you're going to face the Spanish and the Irish scenario, which is the low interest rates, way too low for your own fast-growing economy, the asset price bubble that comes with that, and all the other problems. So actually, to enter under the circumstances that we did, which is precisely at the time when the crisis hit like a hammer, is actually not such a bad thing in terms of the overall macroeconomic stability over the next 3-4 years. So I think that was, of course, completely accidental, but nonetheless lucky on that. But on the other thing, I would like to be skeptical. I would like to be skeptical on the conversion rate forecasting. I mean, there was a lot of discussion that you need to be wise in choosing the rate. Let me tell you from our experience, you can be wise, but you don't know what's going to happen anyway. There was a very big debate in Slovakia over the last 2 years, what's the ideal conversion rate, which was not just among Slovak economists, politicians, international, from IMF to anyone. Everyone had an opinion. And 95% of that opinion was about continuing real exchange appreciation and how we need to make sure that we set the conversion relatively high to ensure that there is no asset price bubble and there is no inflation after the joining. And if you had 100 economists, 99 would sign this as late as June last year. Now the crisis came. The Czechs and Hungarian and the Polish currency went down 25%, and suddenly everyone is crying, saying, why did we enter at such a high rate? It's killing us, the tourists are not coming, the exports are hurting, everyone is hurting. It was such a stupid idea. Why did the government do it? And, the situation reversed in about 9 months. What I'm trying to, of course, crisis in extraordinary times, what I'm just trying to say is that it's impossible to predict the future. I mean, we always keep forgetting that. So that doesn't take away the responsibility from a government to make the best estimate. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have the debate, but I'm just saying that trying to think that, we know what's going to happen is just not very, very realistic in these terms.